Okay, we'll begin. So today we're going to again step back perhaps into history, but look in more detail at the history of the 1990s. We've looked in plenty of detail at the performance, particularly in the fiscal side in the 1970s and the 1980s, but perhaps we haven't really explained what happened in the 1990s. So while this is pretty much a historical relic at this stage, with the demise of the Celtic Tiger, it's perhaps useful to go back and look and say, well, what actually did happen? Can we explain what happened? Given the mire we find ourselves in at the moment, it perhaps would be useful to see, well, what did we do correct before? What did we get right in the 1990s? So when we look at the performance, the long-run performance of the Irish economy, we've noted that prior to 1987, there wasn't really much in the way of positive performance of the Irish economy. So in the 1980s, basically every measure was in difficulty. So you had high unemployment reaching about 18%, high inflation hitting 16%, the public finances were in deficit, in crisis with a huge deficit, the balance of payments were in deficit, and there was a depreciating exchange rate. In a sense, it was hard to find any positive macroeconomic indicator of the Irish economy. At present, we have serious problems, but we do have some positive indicators. Our trade has been positive for the last 18 months to 2 years, with increases in exports, and high inflation isn't something that we're currently experiencing. We have inflation around 2.5%. We do have the problem of high unemployment and a crisis in the public finances, but it isn't as mixed up as it was in the 1980s. So in the 1980s, Ireland was essentially a basket case economy. And The Economist ran a cover of Ireland in the 1980s where we were classed as poorest of the rich, where in a sense we wanted to be viewed as part of the developed world, but we were right at the bottom of that table. So there's a picture of a woman begging on O'Connell Bridge in Dublin. So this was an economy which essentially wants to be part of the developed world, but really in terms of economic indicators, economic performance, was much more a basket case or banana republic. Then, in a pretty short period of time, looking at the mid-1990s, things changed spectacularly. So we went from anemic or negative growth to positive growth, averaging 9% over a 7-year period. Unemployment fell from over 18% to less than 4%. Inflation averaged around 2%. The public finances went from having sustained deficits and huge debt to surpluses, and as a proportion of GDP, quite a small debt, and the balance of payments turned into surplus. So when looking at the macroeconomic indicators in Ireland, there was a huge change road in quite a short period of time. So this was, in a sense, the Celtic Tiger. So during this period when The Economist was running features on Ireland, they ran a front page cover where Ireland was Europe's shining light. So we'd gone from a position of being poorest of the rich in the mid-1980s to Europe's shining light in the mid-1990s. It was a turnaround that was unprecedented, not only in the Irish context, but virtually unprecedented globally. So the change in those key macroeconomic aggregates had been hugely dramatic, and in a very, very short period of time. So what had happened? How had we gone from a basket case in 87 to Europe's shining light and a Celtic Tiger in 97? So we can look some of the reasons for explaining the Tiger. So we can narrow it down to 9 key reasons. We'll work through these in a bit more detail. So we can look at some factors that were in place prior to the 1990s. So some of these factors could have been in place, in fact, beginning from the 1960s. So it wasn't just a case of a switch that was turned in the 1990s. Some of the factors had been put in play over a period of decades. And then some factors that occurred right in the 1990s. Things that seemed to come together right at the same time that ignited the boom, that got the sort of the growth kicking off and hitting for an average of 9%, with up to 12% growth in some years alone, which is a phenomenal performance given where we are now. So the first long-term factor we'll look at is industrial policy. So in Ireland, like when we're looking at the constraints the economy faces, Like, one of the issues we had was a shortage of capital. That if we were looking for investment, we did have the labour surplus, but we just didn't have the investment. It wasn't being generated internally or being generated domestically. So one issue we looked at was look abroad, attract the investment from abroad. So development authorities, agencies were set up to attract foreign direct investment, and we picked sectors that we were going to target. And these sectors were picked, some of them back in the 1970s. So particular sectors were targeted where there was the hope of attracting a number of firms in key areas. So microelectronics, computers, computer manufacturing, computer assembly, pharmaceuticals, medical instrumentation, software, financial services, and telemarketing. So these areas were targeted and said, can we get the large players in the international market to set up in Ireland? That if we don't have the investment to develop these areas ourselves, well, let's try and piggyback on the investment elsewhere. So the R&D could take place in different countries, but maybe we target the manufacturing. We target the lower end of the chain, the supply chain, and look for the production. So there was targeted sectors, and the IDA and other agencies were hugely successful in getting companies to come to Ireland in these sectors. Like, if you take the pharmaceutical sector, 9 of the top 10 companies in the world have facilities in Ireland, and most of them within 20 or 25 miles of us here. If you look at computer software and IT, over a period of time we have developed expertise in that area. And again, some of the largest software and IT companies in the world are based in Ireland. Google, Facebook, Yahoo, Twitter, and other companies that have substantial operations in Ireland. While that area of the economy is successful, it can be a case that it can be exaggerated. Between them all, the multinationals in Ireland hire 100,000 people. There's over 1.8 million people with jobs in Ireland. 100,000 of those are in the foreign multinationals. So there is only one job in 20 approximately that comes from the multinational sector. There are other jobs that feed from it, but it's not the largest employer in Ireland. The domestic economy remains the largest employer, particularly the domestic service economy. So when looking at the employment, it can be easy to exaggerate the impact they have. Plus, when looking at the impact they have on our exports, 90% of Ireland's goods exports come from the multinational sector. They make up a huge proportion of our exports. But they also have high levels of imports, particularly for patents and royalties. As we said, the R&D doesn't take place in Ireland. So the pharmaceutical companies generally don't create the new wonder drug in Ireland. They didn't develop and undertake the research in say, Viagra, in Pfizer and Ringaskiddy. Yet there's huge output when the product is manufactured. So while the exports are huge, the imports are huge. And when looking at Ireland's trade data, Ireland's mercantise trade data is very, very positive. We run a huge trade surplus. But countering that, we also run a substantial services deficit. So when it comes to exporting goods, we sell huge amounts of goods abroad. And that creates a huge trade surplus. So we export more than we import. But if you look at the services side, we run a deficit. And this is again because the multinationals are importing services. So they're importing the patents, importing the intellectual property. So Pfizer, Lilly, Glaxo are paying their foreign subsidiaries the rights to use the patents. So on the services side, we do run a deficit. So when you can look at the impact of the multinationals, it can at times get exaggerated. And the size of the companies has a huge impact. While 90% of our goods exports came from the multinational sector, 10 companies accounted for 1/3 of all exports. So clearly, if 1 or 2 companies change their behaviour or even leave, there could be huge variation in the Irish figures. So just 10 companies accounting for 1/3 of our exports. Right? There are tens, hundreds of thousands of companies in Ireland. Just 10 of them account for 1/3 of total exports. So this is why there's substantial volatility in the quarterly national accounts in Ireland. That given the relatively large size of some of these companies to the overall economy, it can have a huge impact on the figures. So when looking back at the period we're looking at, the contribution of the multinational sector to GNP in 1998 was about 5 billion. Their sales figure would have been a multiple of that. But again, most of that would have been through exports. A lot of that would have been countered then with imports of intellectual property, and then the fact that the profits leave the country, that the profits are repatriated. All that essentially stays in Ireland are the wages paid to Irish workers, and then the fees paid for services of Irish companies. So maybe transport, distribution, storage, property services, catering services, etc. So the contribution was 5 billion. The contribution has increased over the last number of years, but still their sales would far outweigh it. Their sales would be a multiple of 5, 6, 7 times their contribution to national income. So while they do have a strong presence, we can't overestimate their importance. That a lot of what happens actually, the value leaves externally. But there has been huge successes. And if you look at the areas they've targeted, most of those areas have turned out to be success. Maybe the two we'd pick from there that weren't successful, in the sense that they did attract companies, but they haven't stayed, would be microelectronics. The assembly of computers hasn't maintained in Ireland. There has been huge job losses when some of these companies have left. So most recently with Dell in Limerick, and then you can go back through different companies, Gateway in Dublin, Digital in Galway, and other companies that have left. And maybe telemarketing, most visible with Talk and Waterford in the last couple of weeks. That we have been successful perhaps in some of these sectors, but they haven't really been bedded in and tied to the economy. Whereas in other areas we have had huge success and has been maintained. So pharmaceuticals, medical instruments, computer software and financial services have all been long-run successes. And many of these areas were picked in the 1970s. Who does the IDA target? Well, they had limited resources. They couldn't target everyone. So they picked 6 or 7 key areas. As it turns out, a lot of the areas were picked turned out to be quite successful and have been growth areas globally. So that as the global sector has grown, the Irish part of that has also grown. So we have benefit from the areas that have been picked. Again, another long-term view of the Irish economy has been external assistance, particularly from the EU. We were huge beneficiaries of EU aid. So again, in a business sense, we didn't have the capital for investment. And also from a public sense, from a state sense, the state lacked the resources to undertake particularly large-scale infrastructural investment. The funds simply weren't there. So we joined the EU in 1973, and while the EU has been a strong contributor to the agricultural income in Ireland, it has also made substantial contributions to infrastructural investment. So over the period from our entry into the EU in 1973 to the end of Celtic Tiger Phase 1 in about 2001, we received almost 34 billion in net receipts. So the difference between our contribution to the EU budget and what we got back from the EU budget was 34 billion. So we've been huge beneficiaries from the EU. So at present there might be concerns about some of the policies that the EU is making us follow in terms of repayments to bank bondholders, etc. But if we were to look at our membership of the EU in total, we're still coming out as net beneficiaries, given the huge sums that were received. So on average you're looking at about €1 billion a year coming into the economy, or about 4% of GNP, which is a substantial benefit each year. And this peaked in the early 1990s in run to the boom, when almost 7% of GNP was earned. So every so often the Irish Taoiseach and the Minister for Finance would head off to Brussels, go to a meeting and arrive back in Dublin Airport, and they'd step out of the plane with the briefcase, hold it up for the photo shot as if they had the money inside in it. I have 12 billion here, lads, we'll spend it for the next 5 years. So huge sums were earned, and brought into the economy. They were paid under a variety of headings. So some of it was agriculture. So that was to sustain incomes in the agricultural sector. But a huge portion of it was in terms of EU cohesion, trying to equalise incomes across the European Union, or the European Economic Community as it was at the time. So the funds were trying to develop poorer parts of the Union, that if countries had below European Union average income, the money would be spent on investment to try and bring infrastructure up. So the money went on roads, railways, telecommunications, etc. So there was a period in Ireland where you couldn't see a road being developed without seeing a big sign at the start of it. This project was part financed by EU development aid, whether it was the European Social Fund, European Cohesion Fund, whatever it might be. And when they mean part financed, they could have been talking 85 or 95%. The bulk of the money was coming from the EU. And this also improved our sort of project appraisal system in Ireland. Prior to getting to the EU funds, the decisions on projects was a bit haphazard. Do we build this road? Do we develop this railway? Do we improve the road surface here? There wasn't really a kind of a plan put in place and careful cost-benefit analysis undertaken. But to get the EU funds, you had to undertake a fairly stringent project appraisal. And the benefits had to exceed the costs. That it couldn't be simply on political whims that certain projects were undertaken. That it's my constituency and I want this road built, or I want better rail links from this town to that town. You had to actually put out and set an economic costing of why a project should be undertaken. So it actually improved the efficiency of the investment. Not only the EU investment, which in a sense had to be efficient, but also the money we were spending ourselves, because we were able to carry over the methods and techniques developed while applying for the EU funds for our own funds. So this greatly improved the country's productive capacity, and of course also led to employment. Like, one of the big reasons for the collapse we're in at the moment is the collapse in investment. And if you look at the Irish economy and see, well, what factor of economic growth, of the GDP has collapsed? Like, you have government expenditure, you have consumption expenditure, you have investment, and then you have net exports. Well, net exports is booming. GDP might be falling, but that's increasing. Government expenditure is tapering off, has shown some small decreases in the last couple of years, but not to the extent that the economy has collapsed. Consumption expenditure fell in 2008 and 2009 and has been fairly steady since then. The largest reason for the collapse in GDP recently has been investment, particularly housing investment. We've gone from building 90,000 houses a year to 10,000 houses a year. That will lead to a huge drop in output, and that's one of the key reasons why GDP has fallen. During the period while the EU investment was coming in, this was in a sense pumping up GDP, creating employment, creating output, creating growth. So the funds were coming from external sources. So much like the investment to set up companies, the investment required for public infrastructure projects was to a large proportion sourced from abroad. And again, this is something that didn't come into place in the 1990s. This had begun back in the 1970s, once we'd voted to join the EEC as it was at the time. And it really was up until the mid-2000s that we were net beneficiaries from the EU. It's only in the last 5 or 6 years that we've become net contributors, that our income had gone sufficiently far above the EU average that we changed from actually being net recipients from the EU to net contributors. So we now contribute more to the EU budget than we get. And this is simply because our income is far higher. When looking at the third long-run factor, it was investment in education. That while capital and labour might be the two key factors of production, what's also important is what that labour can do. What skills do the workforce have? Can they actually work in these areas? So you can see some of the areas targeted by the IDA were reasonably high-tech areas, that certain levels of skills were required. That in some areas, okay, it was basic manufacturing jobs that would have been towards the lower end, but some of them would have been towards the high end. So investment in education took place, and took place over a prolonged period. That even when the depths of the recession in the 1980s, the one sector that sort of escaped many of the most severe cuts was the education sector. That there was a view, a belief that investment in education was one way to move the economy out of the recession it was in. So this began back in the 1960s. 1967 with free second level education. So up to the 1960s, if you wanted to go to second level, you had to pay for it. So while primary education was free, the greater bulk of people went to the end of primary school, 11, 12 years of age, and then left the education system. In 1967, free second level education was introduced for all. So now that once you got to the end of primary education, you could continue without the addition of fees. So there was clearly a substantial cost now to be borne by the state, and this would only reap long-term rewards. Like setting free second level education isn't going to increase the education level of the population overnight. But you have to, you could be talking a 15, 20, 25-year period. And it wasn't until the mid-1990s that free third level education came in. That in 1996, third level fees were abolished. There was half fees in 1995 and fully abolished in 1996. So a well-educated workforce acts as a magnet to foreign multinationals. If a company is going to come to Ireland and say, we're going to create 1,000 jobs, they don't want to be spending 18 months either finding or training the appropriate people to fill those jobs. They want to be able to fill those jobs immediately. So that was one advantage we had coming out of the 1980s, that we were a labour surplus economy. The workers were available and they were largely well educated. And from an American perspective, they had the additional advantage of being English speaking. So spoke the same language. So a well educated, English speaking and also flexible workforce. Work practices in Ireland tend to be relatively flexible. So the factories, whatever it was, could stay open 24 hours. Ireland doesn't have a disposition against shift work, and also could open hours that suited the base back in America. So if that required being open from 2 to 10 or 2 to 9, whatever it might be, to tie in with American business hours, that could also be handled. So the flexible, well-educated English-speaking workforce was a particular attraction for the foreign firms, and again the US firms, in which most of the investment came from, were attracted by this. So like with the external investment from the EU and the moves to attract capital investment into Ireland from abroad, much of this took place in the 70s and 80s. So once free second level education was introduced in the late 1960s, there was sort of an increase in education participation during the 1970s and 1980s. So while they were in place, they don't really explain the growth spurt. They were there for a long time. If they were the key factors, shouldn't the growth have started in the 1970s and the 1980s? But most of these are considered essential preconditions. That when looking at the long term, this is what you have to put in place. And that once you have that in place, then you can look to the ignition factors. So then look into what happened in the 1990s. Well, in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a return to wage bargaining, national wage agreements, where the social partners got together and hammered out a deal for maybe 2-3 years about agreed wage increases, where the government agreed tax reductions, and the workers agreed productivity increases. So national wage agreements. So wage moderation occurred following a return to centralised wage bargaining. So there are some who suggest that the low inflation of the 1990s was partly as a result of the national wage agreements. So the key social partners being the government, the trade unions representing the workers, and then employer organisations representing businesses. So those three groups would come together and hammer out the deal. So they'd look at what would be agreed wage increases over the next 2 to 3 years. If there was relatively low nominal wage increases, so if workers were promised 1.5 or 2% increases in wages, which were quite low, to make sure then that real wages were increasing a bit more, the government promised tax cuts. So your wage mightn't be going up too much, but your tax bill would be going down. And the worker is primarily concerned with his take-home pay. Like, he's not really too concerned what's happening to gross pay, as long as it's feeding through to to net pay. So gross pay wasn't rising that rapidly, but net pay was increasing because of government promised tax cuts. So for a number of years, these had a role. There are some who say the impact of the national wage agreements is overstated. We were an economy that had 250,000 unemployed people. Like, what upward pressure was there going to be on wages if you had 250,000 people unemployed? Are workers really in a position to come and hammer and negotiate and argue for large increases in wages when there's people outside the door willing to do the same job for a lower wage? So there are some who suggest that these are slightly overstated. One thing they did lead to was stability. That there was a belief that it increased stability, that you could plan into the future, and that there wouldn't be rampant wage inflation for the duration of the wage bargaining. In essence, though, it didn't apply to the entire economy. While some sectors pegged themselves to the national wage agreements, the key sector it was concerned about was the public sector. Like, these are where the trade unions are at their strongest. These had no impact on the US multinationals in Ireland. They have largely non-unionised workers, and they tend to negotiate wages directly with the workers rather than do so through collective wage bargaining. So it only applied to a certain proportion of the economy, and particularly the public sector. And while in the 1990s it led to wage moderation, as we see in the 2000s, in the last decade, the collective wage bargaining and national wage agreements tended to lead to substantial wage inflation, particularly in the public sector, through what was termed benchmarking. That while the private sector didn't follow the national wage agreements in the 1990s, the argument was their wages had increased faster. The public sector had stacked with the national wage agreements in the 1990s, and their wages had hardly increased. There was this argument that a huge gap had emerged, and the suggestion in the 2000s was we should narrow that gap through benchmarking, and there was substantial increases in public sector pay. And now the argument is that we've gone too far in the direction and we need to reduce public sector pay again. So wage bargaining, I'd argue, did lead to stability, but perhaps wasn't the hugely important factor that many would. One important factor was the public finances, fiscal policy. Restoring order. Restoring order to the public finances was a key precondition for the resumption of economic growth. Basically to, in a sense, underpin the sustainability of the state. That if you're looking for investment, if the economy, if the country is on the verge of collapse, it doesn't really suggest that it would be a suitable place for investment. So in the mid-1980s, the public finances were on the verge of crumbling. Huge debt problem, huge deficit problem. And there was issues at the time in relation to the exchange rate, which we'll come to. That if you're going to invest in a country that has its own currency, you don't want to see that currency devalued. You put in $100,000 and get, say, 100,000 Irish punts. If the Irish punt is devalued 10%, well, your investment, has gone down 10% if they devalue their currency. So the issue about the sustainability of the state and the public finances, again, increased confidence, much like the national wage agreements, and stability. The improvement in the fiscal position of the state led to an increase in confidence. So there were substantial cuts in tax rates. In the mid-80s, the standard rate of tax was 35%. So as soon as you started paying tax, it was at 35%. And the top rate of tax was 58%. And you hit the top rate at a relatively low income level. So almost 60% of your income at the top rate was gone. By 2002, the standard rate had been cut to 20%, and the top rate had been cut to 42%. So in fact, in 2002, the top rate wasn't too far from where the standard rate had been 15 years earlier. So it dropped from 35% to 20% for the standard rate. And with a standard rate of 35% back in 1998, the top rate was now 42%. One issue with such high rates of tax is that it leads to an increase in the black economy. If you're giving up such a large proportion of your income in tax, the incentive is to under-declare or not declare income. However, with the tax rates it's hard to know what caused what. Do low tax rates cause growth, or can you cut tax rates because of growth? In a sense, it's one following the other. When the growth kicked off, it became easier to cut taxes. The government was experiencing tax buoyancy. More and more people being in employment, more and more people working, more and more earnings, meant the tax take was rising. That even with the rates falling, they were collecting more and more money. So it can be difficult to say one caused the other. But again, it did act as an incentive to engage in work, and particularly an incentive to engage in reported work. So tax cuts increased the supply of labour and stimulated aggregate demand, because it made it more likely that people would be willing to work. So under fiscal policy, again with the increased income coming in, the government itself was also able to spend more. So we were getting funds from the EU. Government expenditure itself was increasing. Again, particularly on the investment side. The side that's collapsed over the last 2 to 3 years. So the government started to put in place national development plans, where they'd set out what investment would take place over a 5 or 6 year period. So in most cases, the plans were carried out. The current National Development Plan, I think, is towards 2016, has largely been shelved. It was written during the peak of the boom, with huge plans for railways and roads and railway connectors and underground railways and whatever around the Dublin region. But most of those have now been shelved. So again, this expenditure sort of had a multiplier effect in the economy. That increase in employment, increase in expenditure led to money flowing around the economy. It wasn't just domestic factors that led to our upturn. We also managed to piggyback on an increase in the world economy. That if you ask, particularly in America, the best performing president, when looking at the economy, most will reflect back on the performance of Bill Clinton. That the US economy under Clinton had its best performance in recent history. So Clinton, who famously said, in response to some question in the 92 presidential debate about what is the key underpinning of political performance, with his phrase, "It's the economy, stupid." During his time in office, the US economy did perform very well. And this, of course, then feeds through to the Irish economy, because we're very open to trade. That swings in the world economy can have a big impact in Ireland. So when looking at trade with Ireland, non-Eurozone, EMU, Economic Monetary Union countries, accounted for about 4/5 of Irish trade. So Ireland was very dependent on the US economy. And even by 2001, exports were quite large. So the economic performance in the US economy was a major factor behind the growth in Ireland. So in terms of the rising tide lifting what was happening in Ireland, there was a slowdown then because, well, Clinton left office then in 2000 and the US economy downturned after the September 11th attacks, but also a change in economic policy. But much of what happened externally fed through to what happened in Ireland. And then, of course, with global economies growing, we were able to sell them more of the goods and services made in Ireland. But there also was an increase then in tourism. And US tourism is very valuable from an Irish perspective. These tend to be the tourists that spend the most. US tourists tend to come in their 50s and 60s, but after they've raised their family, come for 2-3 weeks to get sort of a feeling of their Irish heritage. And tourism, particularly from the US, increased quite dramatically during the 1990s. In the 1990s, we were looking at entering the Eurozone. So the euro was launched as a currency in 1999. So during the 1990s, countries were looking at EMU entry criteria. How do we get into European Monetary Union? If countries are going to have the same currency, they should largely have the same economic conditions. And the problems of this, of having the same economic conditions, or failing to have this, are largely driving most of the Eurozone problems we have at the moment, that the countries don't have the same economic conditions. So to join EMU, Irish inflation had to drop below 2.7%. So it was 16%, as we said at the start, in the 1980s. Targeting inflation was there, but Irish governments preferred to target unemployment, and that can lead to prolonged periods of high inflation. But after we passed the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, we set ourselves up as looking to join the Eurozone. So we had to meet the inflation target set. So that was getting inflation down to 2.7%. So entry into EMU forced the government to adapt an anti-inflationary stance, actually to look at macroeconomic policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy, and try to get the inflation rate down. That if countries have a common currency, they should have common or similar rates of inflation. And EMU membership also entailed a fall in Irish interest rates down to low German rates. So in the 1980s, it wasn't unusual to have standard interest rates on mortgages of 12, 13, 14%. Whereas now rates on mortgages are 2, 3 and 4%. So if you had a £100,000 mortgage, which would be unusual in the 1980s, you could have been paying 12, 13, 14,000 pounds a year in interest. If you have a €100,000 mortgage now, you're probably paying 2 or 3,000 euro a year in interest. So the cost of money dropped dramatically. So the high interest rates were trying to quell the inflationary pressure. They weren't essentially working. The low interest rates were possible once the inflation rate fell. But by the late 1990s, we entered a situation where the interest rates were actually too low, where the real interest rate was negative. So the real interest rate is the difference between the nominal interest rate and inflation. So if the nominal interest rate is 3% and inflation is 5%, the real interest rate is -2. It essentially pays you to borrow money. That prices and wages are rising at 5%, so next year you'll be earning 5% more. But if the interest rate is only 3%, the real cost of the debt will be falling. So by the late 1990s, this is what happened in Ireland. That with the low inflation and the even lower interest rates, there was incentives to borrow money. But the view was that with wage increases, you borrow 100, 200, 250,000, your wages are going to increase, and in time it'll reduce the burden of the debt. So this stimulated the demand side of the economy, whereas most of the other policies had to a large extent been on the supply side. It fueled the demand side, and particularly the demand side on the house price for construction. This is where most of the large-scale borrowing took place. So while EMU entry criteria was good from sort of a stability sense, it brought inflation, interest rates down. It did have a negative effect when it was looked at where the money actually went. So back in the 80s and the early 90s, we had our own currency. So while now we've ceded our monetary policy to Frankfurt and the European Central Bank, back in the 80s and 1990s, our monetary policy was set by the Irish Central Bank in Dame Street. So we could set our own interest rates and we control over our own exchange rate. And this was really only for a period of less than 20 years. Up to 1979, the Irish pound was sterling. It was pegged 1 for 1. There was no difference between an Irish pound and a pound sterling. So although we had independence, we didn't feel we had sufficient strength to stand on our own with our own currency. Then in 1979 we broke the sterling peg and we tied ourselves to a basket of European currencies. But we were now a standalone currency. The Irish pound had its own exchange rate. It wasn't just simply the sterling exchange rate where we were tagging along behind. So this led to its own problems once we broke the sterling peg. Because actually what happened in the 1980s was that at times Irish pound went up in value. It appreciated. So that meant Irish exports became more expensive. So whereas previously with a depreciating currency it makes your exports cheaper, the Irish pound at times tended to appreciate. So one way of sort of countering that was the high exchange rates, and of course that can curtail a country's growth. One, your exports are becoming more expensive, and the high interest rates mean people are less likely to borrow. So you're affecting both external demand for your produce and internal domestic demand in the economy. So there was a number of instances where we devalued the currency. So there was one in 86 where we devalued by 8%, and then during the currency crisis, the EMU currency crisis, or ERM currency crisis, that went through 1992 and 93, we devalued by 10%. And this has a huge benefit for exports. So if exports, say if the exchange rate of sterling was 1 for 1, so somebody buying 100 Irish pounds of Irish products has to pay £100 sterling. So it costs them £100 sterling. If the Irish punt is devalued by 10%, they now only have to pay £90 sterling to buy the same £100 in Irish of goods. So it essentially made Irish goods immediately cheaper. The fact that the exchange rate was reduced, that the exchange rate depreciated. So it improved our competitiveness. So an appreciating currency hinders your competitiveness. So the central bank followed a policy of stabilising the effective exchange rate. If it appreciated, it tried to bring it back down, particularly for the at occasions when it rose. So the central bank were trying to find a middle ground that at the time sterling was quite strong, and this was in a sense what was pulling up the Irish pound, and the Deutschmark was falling. And this was again sort of trying to have steps towards economic and monetary union, that they wanted stability in the currencies, and if they were all going to become the one currency, that you had to have a stable period leading up to it. But there was times where speculators attacked the rates that were picked, that speculators saw currencies either being over or undervalued and bet against them. So in the mid-1990s, after we'd passed the Maastricht criteria, or the Maastricht Treaty, the view was that we had to stay pegged to the mark. The mark was going to be the lead currency in the euro, and sterling was now outside of EMU, and they weren't going to enter into the euro. So the view was that during the 1990s, early 1990s, the Irish pound appreciated dramatically against sterling. And the UK at the time was our main trading partner. And we came out and said, no, we're tying ourselves to the Eurozone, we're not going to depreciate. And huge efforts were made to try and support the currency. So the currency was felt to be overvalued. So clearly people were selling it. And to try and maintain the value, the Irish Central Bank were buying huge amounts of the currency. And time again, the Irish authorities came out and said, no, the currency wouldn't be devalued. But in the last week in January in 1993, we relented. On the Friday, Bertie Ahern, as Minister for Finance, said we wouldn't devalue, but then by the Monday, they'd relented and devalued by 10%. And there was an immediate boost to our exports because of the devaluation. So the exchange rate policy helped in the fact of making our exports more competitive. A ninth factor was the size of the economy. The economy is quite small. Bringing in a company with 1,000 jobs has a large impact in Ireland. If the UK attracts, say, a Google or a Twitter or a Facebook to set up their world or European headquarters in London, it's a drop in the ocean. Ireland is smaller than Greater Manchester. Manchester is just one city in the UK, not even the second largest city. London would be 5 or 6 times the size of the Irish economy. So getting a large investment into a small economy has a big effect, and the sort of ripple effects can be quite large. So it's a lot easier to turn around a small country than a very large country. So attracting 10, 15, 20 multinationals into Ireland can have a fairly large effect. So the macroeconomic aggregates might have turned around hugely in a space of 10 or 15 years, but it really only takes a couple of things to come into place that can lead to a small turnaround. So the same level of foreign direct investment would have much less of an impact on, say, the UK or the Spanish economy, given their size. So we are one of the largest destinations internationally of US foreign investment. and given the size of the economy, it has a large impact to play. So there have been a huge number of studies on the Celtic Tiger period, what caused it. And in fact, Bertie Ahern now traverses the globe, going around to countries, telling them how they should replicate the Irish model. And these are just 9 factors. We could look and add another 9 factors that led to it. But factor number 10 is very important. If it comes to replicating the Irish performance, do you have the luck? In a sense, it was timing. A lot of these things just came together. That we were in a position to benefit from the upturn, that we had the labour surplus, that there was the growth internationally, that we picked sectors that turned out to be high growth sectors. That, like, who sat down in an office and said, Ireland should target pharmaceuticals, Ireland should target software? That these turned out to be very good decisions. Like, if you're looking at the global economy now, would you be as successful if we said in 2030 we're going to pick 7 sectors to target our investment for the next 20 years? Would you be lucky that 5 of those sectors would be global leaders? So luck was a huge factor in turning the economy around. So that's sort of a historical context on where we've gone. Our next step is to say, like, what did we do when the boom sort of evaporated in the last 3 to 4 years? So we'll take it up with that tomorrow.